All right, welcome to episode 5 of American Spirits. Today I am joined by my co host Ryan Turnipseed as usual. How are you, Ryan?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
Pretty good. It's reasonably cool inside today, so hopefully I won't have to run the air conditioner too much as it's noisy. And we're also joined by Mr. Grant Brooks today to review this book by Van Wyck Brooks. How are you, Mr. Brooks?
I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So, yes, today the book we are reviewing or discussing. This is not a book review show per se, or at all. The Flowering of New England by one Van Wyck Brooks. This book was published in the year, let me just check in the notes here,
1936.
1936. Thank you very much. So this book was published in 1936, and it's written in a uh, interesting style. It's presented as uh, a narrative form rather than a purely historical form that very much puts us inside the mind's eye of many of the American literary figures that this book goes over, such as Emerson, Thoreau, etc. And I will just read a pamphlet. My copy of the book came with a pamphlet from the Franklin Mint, and this pamphlet was published in 1979 that introduces the book and Van Wyck Brooks a bit. So this will allow our listeners to kind of understand what this book is actually about. So, quoting from the pamphlet to our subscribers, when The Flowering of New England was published in 1936, Van Wyck Brooks was already established as one of America's most influential and most radical literary critics. He had shaken the cultural establishment with his argument that art had a social nature and purpose, with his criticism of Puritan materialism, and with his thesis that America was a stifling climate for artistic development. He had argued that cultural reform was necessary if the artistic spirit were to flourish in America, but he had not yet resolved the question of whether or not America had ever had a national culture that could nourish contemporary artists. Hoping to uncover, quote, a usable past, end quote, in the 1930s, he began to write Makers and Finders, a history of the writer in America, 1800 to 1915. The Flowering of New England, 1815 to 1865, the first of the 5 volumes that comprise Makers and Finders, was an immediate popular and critical success. A bestseller, it was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1937. Critic Carl Van Doren called it, quote, not only the best history of American literature, but one of the best literary histories in any language, end quote. The Flowering of New England is a rich, imaginative work that illuminates both a golden age in American art and thought and the mind of one of the 20th century's great literary critics and reformers, the editors. So that was the intro to the pamphlet. I will read just the first page of the pamphlet as well that gets into the contents of the book. Subheading Flowering of the Imagination. Quote, from the opening chapter, the Boston of Gilbert Stuart, set in 1815, to the conclusion, set at the end of the Civil War 50 years later. The Flowering of New England is a penetrating, brilliant analysis of the New England mind as it found expression in the lives and works of its 19th century writers. Van Wyck Brooks focuses on a time later described as New England's Renaissance, a period where there was a springtime feeling in the air, a joyous sense of awakening, a free creativeness, and unconscious pride expressed in the founding of institutions, intellectual, humanitarian, artistic. There's a moment of equipoise, a widespread flowering of the imagination in which the thoughts and feelings of the people, with all their faiths and hopes, find expression. End quote. But Brooks' study is about more than New England. It is the very essence of the Romantic movement rises from the very essence of the Romantic movement rises from the pages, chapter by chapter. Here is the growing faith in the common people, in democracy as reflected in Bancroft's History of the United States. Here is the fervent belief in the perfectibility of human beings, manifested in the rise of transcendentalism, and in the perfectibility of human society, evidenced by numerous utopian experiments, including the most cherished Yankee commune, Brook Farm. We see the growing concern for righting old wrongs in the anti-slavery writers, for instance, or in Margaret Fuller's emphasis on the intellectual equality of women. We find the fresh discovery of the past in historian William Prescott's Ferdinand and Isabella, or Longfellow's Evangeline. There is a newly vigorous extolling of nature by Emerson and by Thoreau in Walden. Here, in short, are all the ingredients that make up America's renaissance of talent and ideas. The flowering of New England is especially about people, about teachers, educators, and bringers of light, who had a deep and affectionate feeling of obligation towards the young republic their fathers had brought into being. That New England was appointed to guide the nation, to civilize it, humanize it, none of them ever doubted, a motive that was evident in all their writings. In memorable portraits, Brooks brings vividly to life the men and women who transfigured New England and American art and thought. In all New England, there was no more perfect embodiment of the romantic ideal than Nathaniel Hawthorne. Only Poe in the South, or Audubon and Stephen Foster in the West, rivaled him in epitomizing romanticism. There, in decaying Old Salem, Massachusetts, the place, the time, and the man came together perfectly. And now, close to the end here, quoting from the book itself, quote, "The Hawthornes, under the shadow of a family curse, were often troubled by an apparition that seemed to haunt their yard. The only son, Nathaniel, who lived like a ghost himself, haunting a little chamber under the eaves, appearing only at nightfall, could not count the times he had raised his head with a perception that somebody was passing through the gate. As no one ever passed through the Hawthorns' gate, it may have been Elizabeth, his sister, who also appeared only when dusk had fallen. In fact, one could live for 2 years under the same roof with this spectral sister and see her only once. That was the way with the Hawthorns. The father, a Salem skipper, had died of yellow fever years ago, and no mortal eye had penetrated, or was to penetrate for 40 years, the Castle Dismal on the second floor, where the mother of the family had taken refuge on the day she had heard the news." End quote. In such a manner, lingering over suggestive details, Brooks constructs the portrait of a great author, utterly fascinating and yet, in the end, still mysterious. End quote. So that's it for that introduction. Hopefully that was useful for the viewers to kind of understand the topical material of the book. And now I will pass it to you, Ryan, first, to beginning an opening commentary you may have here.
All right, so I was going to note probably three things. First is that this book does not lend itself to being excerpted as easily as the other books we've covered on American spirits. So this will be much less screenshot or excerpt based. Just as a warning. So we're probably going to be talking in paraphrases or general ideas that we got from the book. But it's a very influential book, one of the more influential books from the early 20th century in terms of American culture and history. So you can easily find it online if you want to double check what we're saying. But then on to more pressing matters. This book really answers two things. Number one, is there such a thing as American culture? And the answer is yes, and we have a very strong literary tradition to prove it. And this is just one section of the country's literary tradition. So this book was a very good proof that America most certainly had its own literary tradition that was formidable and well respected even across the world. But then the second thing that this answers that's perhaps most pertinent to our audience, we've spent a lot of the last few streams saying that if you try to say the Quakers, the Puritans, or the whoever is like the source of all the bad things, that's a very wrong and overly simplistic view of history. People might be wondering, all right, where do some of these ideas come from? Throughout the stream, we are not going to provide the source for these things because there is no one singular source. There are many different influences that resulted in our progressivism today. But this book does a very good job of explaining the foreign influences on American thought, the colleges, or the most prestigious colleges, and philosophy. So this is the real purpose of the book here is to explain those two things. Yes, America does have a very nice culture and literary history, and also we were influenced by outside foreign philosophies. And then we had a sort of nativist backlash, if you will. They would not have described themselves that way, but this is a anachronistic reading. We had our own homegrown philosophy that developed in response to these outside thoughts and ideas. It is not perfect. In fact, I mostly dislike it personally. But as we've been emphasizing throughout the American Spirits series so far, it's our history and heritage. We can't just discard that because we want to. It's ours, and we cannot change that. And there are good things about it. So, as usual with this stream, something that we're trying to rectify is that if we speak about something in good terms or bad terms, it should be understood there are parts that are good and parts that are bad, and we are generally trying to distance ourselves from low intelligence, low information memes saying that we must dispense with the entirety of part of our heritage or that we must worship another part. So that was my opening thoughts. If any of you all want to comment on it, or Mr. Brooks, if you had your own opening comments.
Yeah, I think this book is definitely interesting, and if the books that it mentions, Hawthorne and others, aren't books that you have personally read, they're likely books that the people that educated you read or felt that they were forced to read. And there is this incredible rich history to New England during this era. The writing that comes out of this era on nearly every level when it comes to things like poetry or navigation or theology or medicine. This is an era in America of enormous, explosive development.
Yes, I should add too that anyone who listened to our prior stream on creating the Commonwealth, where we discussed the economic development of New England and the extensive trade network that they developed with the Old World and the West Indies, as they were known at the time, it should come as no surprise that, given this trade network, that this area of the country, New England and Boston especially, is the first place in which foreign ideas really began to come into the United States uh, in large part. And this was something I picked up on reading this book as compared to the other materials we've read so far, is that there were many references to these literary figures, these writers and poets, and sometimes scientists being influenced by the philosophies of Germans, the French, uh, the Anglos, Scotsmen like Carlyle, who was a vector for a lot of this, and other parts of Europe, and even as far spread as India and China.
Right, and that's so we're going to be discussing a lot of that. And I should say before we get going too much, just to provide more structure for the audience, this book's I would say for our purposes neatly divides into 4 stages. If our stream last week on creating the Commonwealth by Ennis was discussing sort of the decline of the Puritans as we learned about them from Albion Seed, this book starts post decline. So the Puritans are gone. Their influences are still here, but they're not the dominant group within New England by the start of this book, which begins at the end of the War of 1812, basically. So we
Yeah,
have
they've
the
lost their role as the established church of New England, as the theological lodestar. If you don't mind me jumping in right here, Ryan.
Please do. Please do.
Unitarianism is one of the chief things that people will point out as sort of the fall of New England. And if we really want to get into receipts about foreign influence, Unitarianism comes largely out of theological writings that are emanating from Germany, particularly relating to the higher criticism of Scripture, the doubting of these miracles and of the Gospels and all this stuff. And it's worth noting that even the Unitarians in New England are not universally like this is a slow working poison. Andrews Norton, who is one of the most, he's nicknamed the Unitarian Pope because of his position of influence in the 19th century in New England. And he's the father of Charles Eliot Norton, who is this enormously influential social reformer kind of in the 20th century. But Andrews Norton literally wrote a book titled The Evidences of the Genuinenesses of the Gospel. So even in the midst of some of this theological rot that's coming in via the higher criticism, the Unitarians still clung to a lot of things that we would recognize as a sort of mere Christianity. And the thing that they found most offensive about the old Calvinism was it's basically that it was too mean in their minds, that it was too, the word they would have used is bigoted. Brooks Adams, at the turn of the 20th century, writes a book called The Emancipation of Massachusetts, which is very interesting and very good so far as it goes. And Brooks Adams talks about essentially how the Unitarians outmaneuvered the Orthodox Calvinists at Harvard and at these other schools. And because of that, the established church, which was very influential in New England, became the Unitarian church. The Unitarians held this position. But even as they did that, a lot of what you would understand as like mainstream American Christianity has its roots in what we might call Unitarian conservatives, as strange a statement as that is to say. Just because these people were Unitarians didn't mean that they were anything like the rainbow flag waving people of our day, let alone the modernists of a century later.
Right, exactly. And that's what I really want to talk about that here in a second, because that backdrop of the Unitarians outmaneuvering the old Calvinists is really where Brooks, the author of the book we're reviewing or discussing today, that's where he really picks up. So this is you can see this is one of the first major breaks with New England as we've understood it here on American Spirits. There's more. We'll get into that. This is when New England gets its at first very nationalist or federalist identity, and then later its Whig identity. We'll discuss that as well, because there's changes within that. So that's the first stage. The second stage we'll get to is where you really start to get a lot of foreign ideas enter the country, mostly through places like Boston, and then other places will pick it up and become a local centers for innovation regarding philosophies from these foreign ideologies. So this will pick up a lot in the 1820s and 30s, and this will also coincide with New England's allergic reaction to Jacksonianism, if we could put it that way, just to communicate it as briefly as possible. And then these foreign ideas will really reach a peak arriving into the 1840s, and we get sort of an American backlash to them in the form of the transcendentalists, who themselves are not overly traditional philosophically. If anyone has any exposure to the transcendentalists, they would not confuse them for traditional philosophy and theology, certainly. This is a very American backlash. It has its benefits and its drawbacks, but this is sort of like the native philosophy in response to the foreign philosophies entering the country. And then the last stage that we'll talk about is sort of like the decline of the transcendentalists and how their social influence gets I don't know if I would say co-opted, but perhaps degenerates into just a social crusade. So the combination of foreign ideas entering the country, the decline of the transcendentalists and their return to mundane life, and then a new generation coming of age in about the 1850s and 60s. This is where you really start seeing abolitionism becoming a main topic of controversy, social reform, universal suffrage, and whatnot else. And the way I mean that is for everyone, both sexes, all peoples. The transcendentalists had their ideas about suffrage, but it would be taken to a greater extreme after their decline. So these four stages, sort of the post-Puritan New England, the entrance of new ideas, the transcendentalists, and then the decline of the transcendentalists, I would say is a very neat way to understand New England society as we get it from this book. And I think that will answer a lot of our questions that I brought up at the beginning. Does America have a literary tradition? And also, where did all the bad progressive stuff come from? It won't fully answer the last question, but it will give us some clues. So that's all I really had to say at the outset. Are we Anything else we need to add before we start jumping into those categories?
Let me
I'd
just
say go
emphasize
ahead.
the last point briefly for the listeners in terms of where the bad progressivism came from. Listeners to the streams will know we have talked about the so-called Puritan hypothesis basically on every stream, and we're not going to do that for this entire series, but we've definitely done that for the first few parts deliberately. And this is a thesis that I think originated with Mencius Moldbug, although I don't necessarily want to give him all of the credit or blame for originating it, but it's certainly that's how it became popularized at the very least. And through reading these texts, what the history actually reveals is that, as you said, Ryan, you used the word post Puritan. It's extremely spurious to lay the blame for progressivism on the Puritans. We see very much a non Puritan society in New England developing that is descended from the original Puritan settlers, but is largely influenced not by Puritan ideas, but from outside ideas that affected this type of progressivism. And if you want to talk about the so called Puritan hypothesis, it really has very little to do with the Puritans at all. It has to do with the ideas of Harvard uh, at the time. And, in some sense, that is, well, not even in some sense. I mean, these intellectuals at Harvard are
Well,
really
it
someone like
goes well
Yarvin's
beyond
own
that
people.
even. Like I think we could maybe we'll give Yarvin the credit for making it an explicitly political case, perhaps. You could make the case that Arthur Miller, in his very famous invective against the Puritans that was popular in the 50s and that was also served as a sort of quasi pro communist screed, the Crucible, which you may have also had some experience with when you were going through school.
Yes, I read
The
that.
way that and you can see it even a little bit in Hawthorne, and certainly in the Emancipation of Massachusetts and Brooks Adams' history of it. The way that the Puritans are conceived of is essentially as this sort of uh, bigoted savages from the time, from before we were civilized. And in fact, you see a lot of the haunting of New England come about from writers like Hawthorne believing there is a sort of residual guilt from that era and a guilt from the actions of the Puritans.
Yes, and I would argue based on the models or the history presented in the previous book, especially that the Puritans were really the most civilized people in the Americas in their heyday when the Puritans were actually running the colony of Massachusetts. I think that case is made very well by Innes in the previous book we reviewed. They
Right.
created the most modern economic systems in America. They brought in the most modern technology in America at the time, printing presses, ironworks, sawmills, etc.
Right.
Well,
it
and
was New
beyond
England.
that, even the actual traditions, right? The actual schools and the pedagogies and techniques, these all came from the Puritans.
Right, and before we jump on, say, like the Puritan economic system and its influence on the United States, which I believe that Mr. Brooks here on the stream had a note that we wanted to get to at least sometime. I prefer earlier in the stream because it's important. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that so we're talking about these groups viewing the Puritans as savages, despite the fact that I think the case has been strongly made in our previous streams, as Charlie said they were most certainly not savages. We have a great debt to them as Americans, and they have a lot of false accusations thrown at them for no other reason than that people dislike perhaps how strict they were or that they were able to create a successful society. Um, the thing to keep in mind is that we will be discussing the people that really did not like the Puritans today. And we will be tracing their ideas and their influences and how they came to fruition in the country and also the people that opposed them. And we'll see that a lot of early things, once again, not all, but a lot of the early things that we can trace back that are particularly bad for our society, shall we say, come from the people reacting to the Puritans that wanted to dismantle Puritan influence, viewed themselves as anti-Puritan, a lot of these types in particular, the anti-Puritans, give us some real consternation. At least in my view, that was something that I picked up while reading it.
All right. Well, I think we've sufficiently emphasized this point. Why don't we get on into the actual structure you had proposed?
Yeah. So I'll give a brief overview. The first little era that we'll be discussing comes at the end of the War of 1812. And for historical context for everyone, before the War of 1812, there was a anxiety in the new republic as to whether or not it would continue to exist. Foreign European powers looked very hungrily at the former 13 colonies. Britain was not very favorable towards us. They were all much more powerful. So 1812, the war concluding, sort of takes that anxiety away. We remained independent. We didn't lose anything. We didn't gain anything, but we didn't lose anything, and that was the important part. So the anxiety is gone. Now, historically, this launches us into an era called the era of good feelings, with some details being overlooked, but just for brevity, we get this era of good feelings where we still have factional disputes, but nothing to the extremity of the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans that existed prior to the War of 1812. The Federalists by this era would be in their decline as the book starts, and they would eventually give way to the Whig Party as the Jacksonians come into power. We'll get there in a moment, but that's the backdrop. We're in that middle stage between all that happening.
I think it's worth pointing out that a big aspect of the political, what's maybe not peace, but detente that exists is because of this great triumvirate, is what it is called, of these three figures: Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster, of the three of these, is the one that hails from New England, and Webster is an incredible orator. His speeches are a real part of the flowering of New England. He's regarded as among the greatest speakers in the United States in all of our history, let alone this particular era. And these three figures were all a part of the Warhawk faction that led into the War of 1812. And because their political stock has continued to go up in the wake of the War of 1812, they have the political influence to ensure that the government of the country is running smoothly, that at no level do the factional disputes cause jams in necessary projects.
And it's also worth keeping in mind as well, just because I think it would be hard to overstate rather Noah Webster's influence and ability regarding
Daniel Webster, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. These figures are really going to shape America in ways that we can still feel today. So we get. No, it was we did talk about Noah Webster quite a bit. No, I'm not
We
imagining
did
that.
we did in a previous stream, yeah. Noah
Right.
Webster, Lincoln Street, I think. Noah Webster, dictionary Webster.
Yeah, right. And then, but he's once again a New Englander, very influential to our language. So we were discussing the Puritans at the beginning of this, and their great civilizational feats. Something that they inculcated, as Mr. Brooks brought up, was the education that they emphasized so greatly upon their children. Most of the figures that the book goes over were learning either completely different foreign languages outside of the European language families by the age of 5. Some were learning ancient languages like Greek and Latin by the age of 5 or 7. So this is something to keep in mind. These people that are being discussed in the book are the American men of letters, if I could be so bold. They have the linguistic ability, the rhetorical capacity, and the command of language such that they can shape the American language, and they can shape the political scene basically to their will. And they left us with many good works of literature, as I'm sure we've touched on just a little bit here. So,
well, to this point, right, when Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who's one of these men, he's born in 1809. He fights in the Civil War. When he's growing up, being a man of letters was something that was sort of in the back of people's minds, but it wasn't really considered something that actually happened. And he is one of the foremost New Englanders who is first regarded very publicly as a man of letters. And this begins via this poem that he writes called Old Ironsides about the USS Constitution. And this ship had faithfully served us in the War of 1812. The ship actually is what the story Master and Commander is based on. Of course, in the film, they have to change it to the French because I guess they didn't think the audiences could take the Americans and the British at loggerheads, which is kind of an interesting, there's some interesting K lines there. But Holmes writes this poem essentially trying to save the USS Constitution from being scrapped. And it has enormous impact all over the country, and it does in fact save this ship. This ship is decided not to be scrapped because of its history in the United States, because of Holmes bringing this up and writing this beautiful ode to this American warship.
Right, and this is it may seem somewhat obvious, but I think verbalizing it might help. These men of letters, through the use of their language, actively preserved real history. Like the Ironsides is a real thing. You can see it, you can look at it, you can feel it, and as you said, it is only around because of the men of letters of this time. So this is I think this might be something that people sort of subconsciously skip over when they hear men of letters. They might think that it's ethereal or perhaps just words, but not so. It's absolutely integral. If you were to have a distinct nation, you have to have people with mastery over the language. And something else to keep in mind here, just for the general overview of this stage. Once again, we're in a post-progressive era. The Unitarians really have cultural dominance at this point. Unitarians, if I'm to use very basic language, are much more lax than the Puritans were. I think in the mainstream, the Unitarians are classed under, at this point of time, even under liberal theology. I don't know if that's entirely accurate, but it kind of gives
I think
you
in
the
the
idea.
mainstream, you could definitely cast them that way. I think Boston and New England specifically are the places where you see a sort of conservative Unitarianism, as strange as that maybe sounds. The thing about the Unitarians is it was really more of an attitude. There was an agreement of rejecting dogma as such, and the name Unitarian is kind of going after the Trinity, right? And that was something that they generally agreed on. They generally did not hold to that doctrine. But it was really about being very cerebral, men of letters, men of learning, not the sort of person who would ever dare to deliver a fire and brimstone sermon, not the sort of person who would ever go before their congregants and tell them that they were in danger of going to hell. That was the sort of mindset that the Unitarians wanted completely expelled from New England, and that they believed that the Puritans were the representation of.
Right. Also, part of this Unitarianism is something very interesting. They were, once again, very involved in politics. And they aren't, if you want to try to excise them, you're going to have excise them rather from American heritage and history. You're going to have a tough time. You can like or dislike them, but they are, if you're American, they're part of your history. They signed your Declaration of Independence. So I be very careful trying to just purely excise parts of your identity and history. Something that I would say that was a definite positive that they contributed to is that we have sort of this like national assurance or this national self-confidence after the War of 1812 that was largely fueled by these men, the more nationalist types in the cultural scene, because they, as Van Wyck-Brooks points out, even the British and the other European powers were starting to recognize begrudgingly that the Americans were competent fighters. They had a very distinct and in some ways respectable culture. They especially the British at this point in time disliked it, but it was recognized to be separate and a culture which at this point in the world, 1815 to about 1820, that cannot be said of everyone else. So this is the basic outline that I have. I was going to just briefly describe the differences in location because this comes up a lot in the book, and I think it's sort of important. you have a few areas within New England that are responsible for its character. Obviously, you have Boston, which is a very major player in the American Revolution. Obviously, I think most of our audience would be familiar with that. It is the center of a lot of the patronage networks for any culture and artists that arose during this time. Though there's a, I think Brooks sort of subtly or not so subtly at times makes the argument that these patrons were not so much interested in the art and the pursuit of art, rather they just thought that this was a more civilized thing to do. We have Harvard, the university, which will, as we get into the second sort of stage or second era of New England history in this book, will become very important. Harvard at this point in time, if I remember correctly, was just taken over by Unitarians. And then we also have sort of like the countryside, if you will, which will, especially as we get to the transcendentalists, represent a third part of New England culture. So that I thought was like the main overarching points of this. It sets us up for the next parts. Did you guys want to mention anything here?
Well, I'll real quickly get into kind of calling back here a little bit before we skip over it. One of the other big contributions the Puritans made was in the field of economics. Alexander Hamilton is the name that we all know in terms of pioneering the American school, but the other big figure in the American school is a political economist by the name of Daniel Raymond. Daniel Raymond is himself a New Englander as well, and he writes this book called The Elements of Political Economy in 1823. And he brings in a lot of ideas from the Puritans into this idea of the American system. And in the later assessments of his work, it's pretty clearly, it's very obvious that what the American system is an explicit and scaled up form of Puritan economics. There are two particular quotes I want to read describing Raymond's text. The first one, quote, early in his text, Raymond asks whether capital is a cause of wealth and answers in the negative. Labor is a cause of wealth and land is a source of wealth. Capital, however, is neither. It is merely an instrument in the hands of man, end quote. And what this basically means is that the idea of capital was that it was meant as, it wasn't that the money had value in and of itself. It wasn't that the way that they viewed money was like a dragon hoarding gold. The idea was it's serving as trust. It's serving as an IOU. It's serving as a way to improve the lives of the people using it. And it had to be productive in and of itself as well. And this is a really critical concept to understand in terms of why the American system views economic development the way that it does. And there's this other quote from the same section, quote, Raymond considered that the labor that laissez-faire advocates like not to be worthwhile to civilization. Protectionists understood what was a useful pursuit and what is a blight. Raymond stated that a destructive occupation is a detriment to civilization and that a pursuit fails to help society if it has no ability to increase the standards of the requirements and conveniences of life or to foster the joy and happiness of society.
Right, and for anyone that listened to our last few streams where we talked about the Puritans, that should sound very much like the Puritans. In fact, we discussed this whole the very extreme Puritan ideal in its most purely theocratic form. The economy is very much beholden to society, which is hard to object.
Yes, and this is the root of the reason why the Puritans did the coin clipping, the famous pine tree shilling, and all of this stuff. This is a very critical piece of this project that the Great Triumvirate is undertaking. Someone like John C. Calhoun From a purely factional perspective, the South could absolutely have tried to detonate this project and would have had the strongest reason for doing so. But because Calhoun and his friends understood what they were actually doing here and had this unity about themselves about what they were trying to do, they are able to act in concert. It is one nation that is being built brick by brick.
All right. Yeah, that's very good. Was there anything else on this first stage? Because I sort of see it as introductory to the meat of the book.
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay, right. So that's the start. And to be clear, the Unitarians, the post-Puritans, do have their own ideas and philosophies, and they are once again very influential to the Americans. It's just less important for us here. Maybe you, the audience member, might find some importance in them. So around about the 1820s, we start getting generations of men returning to New England who have studied elsewhere, or they have studied philosophers from elsewhere. So this very academic culture that the Unitarians had fostered led to searching for outside influences and was brought a lot of adherence to them. A lot of these philosophies were German. I kind of view it as a buzzword now, just because anyone that wants to sound smart online says the phrase. But German idealism is one of the big ones that was imported over here. But there are many others. This time period in the 1820s, these new or slightly more foreign ideas is really where I would say the Americans import the first notions of romanticism. And the reason that I say that, I want to be very clear, is because the Puritan system was not romantic. It was very much Calvinist, very Christian. That you can't really try to abstract it into romanticism without just losing Puritanism. The Unitarians were excessively rationalistic, as many people, even some of their defenders, would claim, and tended to they tended towards some sort of materialism. The new ideologies that were being imported into New England and largely entering through Boston and largely taking hold in places like Harvard, tried to counter both the excessive Christianity of the Puritans, because once again, a lot of people in this era did not like the Puritans. They were seen as outdated. They were old. And then the rationalist Unitarians were also being countered. They were overly rationalistic. So the new ideologies being imported really emphasized things like sense, feeling, experience, the typical things that one would associate with Romanticism. And it's very important to note that this is foreign. We did not develop this. It was very much imported. People had to study abroad to bring these ideas in their system over here. Not to say that there weren't any concurrent similar ideas, but those would be different, and they are most definitely not the dominant strain that was imported. And something else to keep in mind is that this is where New England, this is in the era of about 1820 to 1840, where New England really gets its own distinct identity within the United States, but separate from the rest of its parts. Because during this period of time, you have the presidency of one John Quincy Adams, and then you get a whole era defined by Andrew Jackson, which the New Englanders were opposed to, not just in politics, but in terms of temperament. Andrew Jackson is like the opposite of a New English elite. So this is something to keep in mind. New England is becoming more distinct. It's importing foreign ideas. And before perhaps anyone on our side is tempted to throw all this out immediately just because they hear foreign ideas that might have bad consequences later, the main conduit for a lot of these ideas being imported is one Thomas Carlyle, a very influential and famous literary critic of the time and himself a philosopher. Now, personally, I like Carlyle. I don't like a lot of the foreign ideas that were imported. It's unfortunate for me that that's how it is, but this is something to keep in mind. Not all of these people are completely bad. They're not irredeemable, and they have good things we can take from them. But it's worth noting this is all foreign. So that was the overview I wanted to give here.
And I think
yeah.
there's something to be said too for the fact that these people are all voracious readers and highly intellectual and are seeking the truth. like you're not gonna. They're simply not living under a rock, and they're not living so far from civilization that they're not affected by what's going on in the continent. And it's worth noting as well that because during this era we don't have the sort of like dominance of the United Kingdom over America, because of that, the influences from Europe are a lot stronger from places like France and Germany.
Yes, and that's very good to keep in mind. But that is not to discount actually something that might be very important. And the reason why these people would be looking towards France and Germany is something I forgot to mention. The earlier Unitarians politically were very conservative, and I don't use that phrase anachronistically. They were looking to figures like Burke against the French Revolution. They were Van Wyck Brooks describes them as Tories. So this is something to keep in mind. This new generation coming back is very much counter to the Unitarians, the post Puritans, if you will. They are more romantic, more liberal in certain ways, and they are sort of opposed to this conservatism that had dominated the New English elites. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think Van Wyck Brooks has a great segment where he's describing just the temperament of New England and their elites at this point in time, this early stage, the second stage when the new ideas come entering. They are very collected, calm, calculative. They are very they understate a lot. That's their main rhetorical device is understatement, and they're very polite and courteous. So New England, once again, if anyone is familiar with the personality of someone like Andrew Jackson, New England's ideal personality is the exact opposite. So these younger men coming back, they do have some sort of stifling culture to revolt against, if you want to use that frame. It's they are much more vital. I would say that is perhaps the most redeeming characteristic. As we'll get into, I think a lot of their ideas have had bad consequences, but they are much more vital than the older New England elites, the Unitarians that existed at this time. So, anything on that?
Nope.
Okay, so like I said, this will take root. It comes in through the main city, Boston, takes root in the main university, and this is where I think a lot of the stream will need to rest. Is the reaction to this? Just because I don't think we really need to go into this. I think most of our audience can understand foreign ideas entering the United States between the years 1820 into the 1840s and continuing. You can probably get a good idea of what that is. It's going to be continentally liberal. And this elicits a reaction from the Americans in kind of the New England rural areas or the periphery. And this will be the transcendental movement. Most Americans have to learn about the transcendentalists in the public education system, but they get a sort of butchering of it because it turns out most modern school teachers cannot begin to comprehend what the transcendentalists were doing. The transcendentalists have to be understood in a sort of New England context. They are not against New England culture, and Van Wyck Brooks makes this point. They just apply it differently, and that can be good or bad. In fact, I think Charlie was making some good points before we started that we should probably discuss here on stream. That a lot of this stuff is just getting basic reality backwards, but these transcendentalists represent a very native reaction to the foreign ideologies that began to enter New England. They were very much drawn to, influenced by, and promoted nature. So in that sense, they're kind of romanticist. But they were also a little bit more realistic than the romantics. They actually tried to live in nature, would be one of the big differences, unlike the romantics who typically fled the countryside into the cities and then reminisced about the countryside. So that's a sort of reversal there. The transcendentalists sort of kept the calculative New England culture. They just calculated that living a normal life was not worth it. They would much rather be in nature. So this is something to keep in mind. This is something that Brooks makes a point that he makes in his book. Is they just apply New England culture with different value judgments, if you will. And this will produce perhaps some of our most influential American writers, including people like Emerson and Thoreau. So, Mr.
Yeah,
Grant Brooks.
these figures are what you might, in a modern telling, call swamp Yankees, and they follow this pattern that you actually see over and over again in New England and arguably in America, but particularly in New England, of this idea that the city has been too corrupted by foreign influences, and that this faction that is kind of on the outs but still has a legitimate claim to be the inheritors of New England civilization is going to come in and set things right. And Emerson,
Yes. Yeah.
go ahead.
I was going to say before we got too far into them, uh, and I'll of course let you continue. We might really want to go into what we think are some of like the bad parts here, because I keep alluding there are bad and good parts. We might want to really start digging into the bad parts and treating them properly. But yes, please continue, because this is both the foreign side and the transcendentalists we need to analyze.
Well, and I think there's probably something to be said too, that because of the general stupidity of American educators and the fog of the present time, or the last generation, let's say, people tend to read the transcendentalists kind of like the hippies or the 60s radicals, which is not an entirely illegitimate reading, but winds up giving you a lot of wrong impressions about their priorities and about the way they understood America.
Right. Yeah. So I did notice we when I was going through high school, at least is where you get some of the transcendentalists in a better form. Uh, I think there was a want to liken them to the '60s hippies and radicals, but it was never explicitly stated. Reading this, I can see how you can arrive to that point, but there's something that really separates them in that they are much more nativist, and not in terms of party political matters, which was something else during this time. Just in the basic form of the word, they were very American. They were opposed to a lot of the excesses and the very strange ideologies that were entering the country. They were very New English. These transcendentalists, and they sought to actually live their lives. So
They
before
definitely
we
had this strain of like anti-hedonism, yeah, which is the biggest distinguishing factor. There's a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of his most famous speeches, which is delivered at Harvard. And this speech is called by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. the Intellectual American Declaration of Independence. And one of the quotes in the speech that Emerson says is, quote, "The purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have made some difference, that you have lived and lived well." And that's just a totally, that is a totally foreign conception to something like the hippie movement.
right, it is basically the opposite of being self-centered. Uh, Definitely in the rhetoric. Now, I will say there is a critical reading you can give them that I think we should at least discuss, because I am not a transcendentalist. I am sympathetic towards them, but I really don't agree with them. Um, a lot of what they did, I would say, sort of inverted social orders, which might be why modern public school teachers read them and try to liken them to the hippies, because that might be they might notice the sort of upending of previous social orders and just associate that with their childhood, perhaps. Um, but this is something we should give attention to. Um, the transcendentalists really if you can remember a few streams ago when we were talking about Puritan society, the transcendentalists have some of the ethics of Puritanism, but they are very much opposed even to Puritan society. So we've been talking about how their reaction to the status quo in New England, the foreign ideas, the Unitarians. You would think maybe they would liken back to a prior system, the one that built the place around them, but you would be very much mistaken if you just assumed that. They were new. They tried to build something new. Um, I believe Charlie, you had some thoughts on this. I don't want to quote you if that was what you were going to bring up, but what you had to say was very, I agreed with, where they just sort of tried to take normal things as we've accepted them throughout our civilization and just reverse them. But maybe I've put too many words in your mouth.
I'm trying to bring up where was that something I was saying off air before we started?
Yeah,
In the
yeah,
group chat?
yeah, writing and all this other stuff. Because I believe that was in the context of Thoreau's, who we'll get to more in depth in a moment, but his idea of the week and the year in terms of work and leisure.
Oh yes. This struck me as particularly egregious, given that I'm a person who spends a lot of time working in nature now. But I can't remember the exact Thoreau quote, but he basically wanted to invert the system placed into being. Well, in the book of Genesis, where you work for 7 days, or sorry, you work for 6 days and then take the seventh off. Thoreau believed that man should toil for one day and then have 6 days of rest and relaxation. And I find this sort of this sort of, I don't know, carefree thought, as if like we should just have the ability to sit around and enjoy the colors of the leaves and sit around navel gazing as intellectuals, thinking about how beautiful the sounds and trees, birds, and chirps within nature are, and all the little critters that run about. I mean, I just find this sort of stuff offensive, given the realities of life and the hardships that are required to actually work in the conditions where one is actually exposed to this on a daily basis. And
Well, and
this left a yeah.
you're not the only person who is offended by this. Like, I think this is one of the hardest bifurcations between the New England spirit and the sort of like cracker aristocracy of Andrew Jackson and of the human farmers. Because hearing this stuff for them was frankly insulting. Like, and I have a lot of ancestors who come from this stock, right, where it's like you have to be prepared to kill and die in order to protect your little homestead that you have to till every single day and the animals that you have to feed every single day to ensure that your family can eat. And this situation that you have in America is the best situation that your family has had, and it's still extremely precarious. And it is bought by blood. And to have someone basically be like, oh, I wish I could smell the roses most of the week and then like put in a day's work, like the hell is wrong with you? And why does this person get to vote and I don't? Like, I think that's a hard undercurrent of the Jacksonian democracy that does transform the American political order.
Right, and this is a something that is very easy to forget about, but that we should keep in mind is that there's there's another part of the country that exists at this point in time. The book is focused on New England, but you do have to keep in mind that the Jacksonians just dominate the country at this point in time. And once again, they're the opposite of the New England culture and ideal and aristocracy. So, yeah, this is a very good point. The sort of the struggle for for male suffrage, whenever you see the New England property owners basically giving into primitivism. The other thing that would have struck them as poor, these Jacksonians, who by the way mostly were just usually low church Christians, low church meant in the historical sense. Um, a lot of these transcendentalists were perennialists. Meant exactly as you in the audience, if you've been paying attention for the last little while, would understand the term. They looked to basically historical other schools of thought, philosophies, religions, Zoroastrianism, Confucianism, Islam, and uh, all these other established schools of thought elsewhere in the world, and tried to look for truth there that they could see. They could see if they could find the same truth in other works to try to figure out what was just naturally true was the idea. Everything here is rooted in nature. They were very perennialist.
Well, and Brooks Adams makes this argument explicit in history. One of his most well known works, probably his most well known work, is called The Law of Civilization and Decay. where he essentially, the case that he makes is that the engine or backbone of every great empire is a middle class, a human middle class that fights your wars, and that every great civilization, by its greed, essentially extinguishes this class and makes it impossible for them to live their life and exist, and thereby loses itself. And he makes this case for Rome, and he makes this case for France, I believe. He makes this case for England as well.
Right. I don't mean to discount your point, but the place I was going in particular of highlighting how they would go to foreign modes of thought was that if anyone of our audience remembers back to the Mencken stream about the American language, specifically about how the King James Bible was perhaps the most important document in shaping the American language. Um, this is blasphemous. This transcendentalist group. I once again have great sympathy for them because they were trying to fight this onslaught of foreign ideas, but they themselves they organically developed something that was very different, especially in New England society. The fact that they were looking towards these heathen religions instead of looking at what we actually had, and Van Wyck Brooks points this out that they very rarely actually looked to the prophets of the Old Testament, the epistles of Saint Paul, these things that which were absolutely foundational in shaping our language, the things that were the basis for New England society. They sort of just discarded that. The other side did too, but we wouldn't expect anything less of them. But the sort of nativist reaction in the transcendentalists just dropped this major document.
Yeah, my read on the transcendentalist reactionaries, we might call them, especially in their youth, in the 1840s. My read on them was basically very similar to what has happened, what is repeated in our universities over the last several decades, in that there are these people in these ivory towers, as we call them, observing social problems that they don't actually have any uh, connection to in real terms. They have no real basis for their understanding. They've only read about it in books or heard about it. They've, in the transcendentalist times, maybe they've heard about how horrible it is that New England's economy still relies on Southern continent slavery. And then they spiral, instead of actually looking back to anything, instead of looking back to what actually worked with their ancestors and trying to anchor the solution in reality, they, to put it bluntly, spiraled up their own asses into utter nonsense, much like modern intellectuals have. And I also found these modes of thought just it makes me want to puke. I mean, perhaps I will read a bit, if you don't mind, from the younger generation of 1840 chapter. Just a few
Yeah,
things
please.
that particularly stood out to me. So I'll skip around a bit because the book is quite difficult to excerpt, but this might describe sort of the intellectual youth culture in the 1840s when these burgeoning transcendentalist reactionaries were becoming getting enculturated in Boston and Massachusetts. So, quote, Boston, all New England respected learning. No New England boy was allowed to question that he was destined to succeed in life, provided he knew enough. And Boston was determined that the boys and girls, and the blind and insane as well, should have an opportunity to know enough. Schools based on the best current theories, reform schools that really worked reform, schools for the blind that cause the blind to see. Was not Dr. Howe's famous pupil, the blind, deaf, and dumb Laura Bridgman, a proof that education was the mother of wonders? Boston had taken Channing at his word and really believed in perfectibility. And I'll elaborate there. I don't know if we mentioned William Channing specifically, but he was a theologian liberal theologian by the time standards, who traveled to Europe actually. And when we talked about how foreign ideas came into the country, how did that happen? Well, people like Channing went to Europe, uh, was imbibed their ideas through associating with their own intellectuals, brought back their books. The books were loaned out, not by him exclusively. I'm talking about him and other people. The books were loaned out to other readers, other people who had collections of books, universities, whatever, and this is how these ideas actually spread. So the ideas were literally imported on paper into people's heads. Anyway, continuing on that, a Boston man had to be learned at something, and the passion for learning on the upper levels soon spread through all the other strata. Harvard set the pace. Thomas Wentworth Higginson was not unique as one who, at the time of his graduation, read French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, and Greek, who later acquired German and Portuguese, Hebrew, a little Swedish, and always hoped for a chance to study Russian. Theodore Parker, the minister somewhat older, the Roxbury Friar Tuck, the Lexington farmer's son who was able to carry a full barrel of cider, read Dutch, Danish, and Russian along with the others. Coptic, Chaldaic, Arabic, Ethiopic, and was found by one of his friends deep in a grammar of Mpongwe. I can't even pronounce that language. So we can see here how this is the era of the public intellectual and the era in which everyone in New England and in Boston especially was expected to be educated on some sense on these topics that actually had no real relation to their daily lives. And I emphasize there, we can see in the sheer number of foreign languages that they're learning. This is not merely to learn the language, but to read the books in these languages that are coming out of the continent at this time, right? So this is part of how these ideas are actually spreading.
And
Let's see.
I would
Yeah.
say something just because our usual guest, Mr. Quinn, isn't here to say it. But the Puritans were very educated, and you had Puritans that knew many languages. They were well educated, they were academics, and they were dedicated to this. But the thing that prevented them from developing the way that New England was at this era is that you had the Puritan society and church there to sort of guardrail them and focus them on things that were, godly. You don't really have that at this point in time. It's gone. The virtue is gone. The society is post-Puritan. I'm sure Mr. Quinn here would make a point about them being much more materialistic, which, granted, the transcendentalists were arguing against, and they were trying to find the reason they were the transcendentalists is they were trying to sort of bypass this materialism. But still, this is they're still focused on these other worldly philosophies that they could find in the Orient, the Near East, and whatnot else. This perennial idea. If you wanted to make an internal criticism, I think it would be an easy argument that their focus on the perennial conflicts very much with their skewing of the material. So I'm just trying to channel our usual guest there. Hopefully he approves, but I think that might be need to be made explicit. The Puritan systems are gone, and that's why suddenly this very educated and erudite class becomes a sort of a strange social phenomenon instead of just another generation of Puritan scholars.
And when we talk about materialism, we're really talking about the Puritan focus on the producing the fruits of their labors, right? That's what Puritan society was very much focused on, was doing work and improving the time and building all of these great institutions in the first place. It's
Right.
not a sort of petty materialism that one might think of when that word is used in a modern context.
Yeah, right.
Let me read a bit.
If you secularize that, you can sort of see how it could become petty. Like if you
Exactly.
just remove all of the roots. So
let me read a little bit more on William Ellery Channing specifically. Quote, William Ellery Channing, the doctor's nephew and namesake, refused to go to chapel. Determined to be a poet at any price, he absconded from college with his clothes and took refuge in a lonely farmhouse. I think this might be the Dr. Channing's nephew, or sorry. Yeah. So this isn't the previous Channing I mentioned. Who took refuge in a lonely farmhouse. All these notions were very disturbing. The young men said that terrestrial love was only a reflection of celestial love. They spoke of bathing in a sea of thought. They went off mooning in the woods. They refused to talk about railroads, banks, and cotton. They had no use for Blackstone and Justice Story. They were unwilling to be mere lawyers. Heaven save the codfish in the State House. They laughed when their fathers quoted Dr. Johnson. They smiled when their uncles quoted Burke, who had become a very old story. Goldsmith and Pope to them were as flat as stale beer. They spoke of the president of the college of President Littlego of Triflecut and referred to Cambridge as donut. They sneered at Dr. Phosphorus and lawyer Smealan and Swippen's wholesale grocery concern. They remarked that the great art of being a merchant is to look wise and ride in a carriage. Poetry was the only life for them, or painting, or contemplation, if they had to starve in the garret or a hut. And if all this was not the result of reading, where, pray, had they acquired their notions? The mothers and aunts and cousins of young New England, not to speak of the fathers who carried on the wholesale grocery business, the cotton factory and the firm in State Street were filled with alarm and dismay. So we can see here how the youth are rebelling against the running of business that their fathers were involved in and are much more interested in taking walks in the wood and really doing anything other than the type of labors that the Puritans engaged in so that they can write their poetry, paint, or simply sit there and contemplate. So
I think there's definitely a reading of them that is like the rebellious youth, but I would say that there is an argument of rebelling against a sort of a stultifying life. Like one of the other quotes that I wanted to quote from Emerson's The American Scholar lecture is, quote, "Character is higher than intellect. Thinking is the function. Living is the functionary. The steam retreats to its source. A great soul will be strong to live as well as strong to think," end quote. And I think maybe the more charitable reading of a lot of these people is that all of the books that they have been raised with from before they knew anything, right? Putting greatness in their hearts, but completely unmooring it from the dogma of scripture and of the Puritans, of their Puritan ancestors. You've told these people to be great, and then you have essentially at the same time said, yes, well, but also you're going to be a nice little shopkeeper. Like what you have lost is the ability that you've lost the Puritan notion of calling, which can make the life of a shopkeeper or a lawyer or a judge into service to God, into a great life.
Right.
yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
if you remember back to the very rationalistic Unitarian culture, this getting rid of this Puritan theology, that this is what it gets replaced with. It turns out the rationalist culture really likes academics for the sake of academics, which is not Puritan.
Yeah, so we certainly can't condemn the transcendentalists for coming up with these ideas as the only alternative they could see to the failings of the Puritan system to uphold that style you were just talking about. But also we have to recognize that this is not a sufficient alternative to the original Puritan system. As I said before, rather bluntly, it's strikes me rather much as a group of intellectuals going very much up their own ass and being rather detached from the realities of the world as if these daily tasks and the actual running of the society is something that can simply be ignored so that one may lead this blissful life as a poet. But I'm very much uh, not one to take such views charitably. My constitution does not take kindly to people who think like that. So I'm certainly biased against any worldview that looks like that.
Right.
Also,
And that was that was what I was fishing for earlier. So I'm glad that was put out there, because that was the negative side that I wanted to get out. And just because the way that these streams work is that if people hear 20 or 30 minutes of critique, they immediately associate the thing being critiqued with just bad. Just to sort of buttress that, as I said at the beginning, not all of these things are irredeemable, totally bad. Mr. Brooks, I believe you had a very good point to make about the transcendentalists as they did regard nature. So now that we've critiqued them, I think you had a different and positive reading about them that might be useful for us.
Well, so this essay that Emerson or this speech that Emerson gives the American Scholar, which, as I had mentioned previously, Oliver Wendell Holmes regards this speech as the American intellectual Declaration of Independence. This is the moment where, certainly in Holmes' mind, and I think in the mind of most of New England, America is finally severed from English cultural control over the academy. And what it is this idea of America is the student not of England, but of nature taking the primary place in terms of what America looks to. And there's this pejorative that people use for scripture, for biblicists, right? Like me and my Bible under a tree. But if you think about it, this is like exactly what America is. That's like the definition of America is me and my Bible under a tree. Like, and while the transcendentalists, there are a lot of negative aspects to them, this emphasis on nature is something that is deeply, deeply within the American soul. And even when it definitely doesn't have the expression that the transcendentalists give it, right, of 6 days of leisure and 1 day of work, the American is so shaped by nature, by the landscape, and by this land, this promised land that we've been given. Nearly every writer up until the last century or so has remarked on the effect that the land has had on the Americans, the effect that nature has had on the Americans. And I think that that's probably the biggest contribution of the transcendentalists, and certainly the biggest contribution of people like Emerson or Thoreau, is placing nature at the center of America. And this is something that is a legacy that moves on. America is really the country that pioneers the notion of a national park. And our conservation efforts find a lot of their genesis in these transcendentalists.
Right, and this is something that I would like to emphasize. This viewing nature as the main foundation of America. If we are, as we've been describing now for over a month, trying to describe the American nation, show that it's distinct, it's its own thing, it developed out of primarily the English, with other groups mixed in. This is very much the land. If any nation needs to have an actual homeland, it's the transcendentalists that really put that in the center. This is something that is very integral, inseparable from the idea of a nation. So this goes towards our project here, sort of giving a friendly history of America for our people here, and also trying to describe what it is that we are. The transcendentalists putting the land at the center is, I would say, just an unmitigated good thing. Now, I will say the way they took it at times are aberrant, at least in my view. But the fact that they had nature as a primacy, this is our land. There's something to that, something that is transcendental. I think that it would be very difficult for any American, certainly, to argue against that very basic statement.
Yes, and I'll read from
the.
I just want to read a bit from the pamphlet that touches on this, from the editors. So, really quick quote: "With the same skillful prose and deft touches, Brooks brings to life Thoreau at Walden, one of the immensely important moments in American history. Much of the modern world's conservation movement, national park systems, game and bird refuges, endangered species lists, and dozens of other aspects was anticipated here at Walden, where Thoreau sought to live at one with nature." Quoting from the book, quote, "Henry felt at home in his sylvan dwelling. It was quiet, clean, and cool, fit to entertain a traveling god. For company, birds flitted through his chamber, red squirrels raced over the roof, chickadees perched on the armfuls of wood he carried. There were moles living in the cellar. He had occasional visits from a hare. Sometimes, on a summer morning, he would sit for hours in his sunny doorway, amid the pines and hickories and sumacs, in undisturbed solitude and stillness. The birds flitted noiselessly about him. He could feel himself growing like the corn. The wildest imagination could not conceive the manner of life he was living. End quote. So that just touches briefly on Thoreau, and it helps make the point that the transcendentalists are certainly responsible for the genesis of the conservationist systems we have in America now. And as it must be pointed out, as we have done on all the streams in this series so far, we have to accept this group as part of our shared heritage, and none of the groups we have talked about on the show can be resoundingly condemned in any particular way. While we may point out some of the problems, some of the many problems that they may have, nonetheless, this is a part of our heritage that has to be reckoned with. Anyway, Mr. Brooks.
Oh, I was just going to make the point very quickly. I think the other thing you could say about the transcendentalists is that they are sort of stumbling in the wilderness and occasionally grasping at things their ancestors more or less said explicitly, but within a Christian framework, right? Like the whole idea of the beauty of this land, of this particular soil, is something that was said explicitly by the rulers of Massachusetts Bay when it was a Puritan colony, right? That this was our promised land.
So I'm glad that you brought that up because I noticed there's a section in the book talking about the transcendentalist schooling, education, and whatnot else. Because there's sort of a sub uh, uh, part of this book, a sub discussion about education in especially in New England, which is important for the rest of the country because the educational philosophies in New England that start there spread to the rest of the country. Um, I found it very interesting that the attitude or the view of the transcendentalists towards education that there's sort of like this inner ability or inner person that just needs to be cultivated by education as opposed to an empty vessel that needs to be filled up. I think is the thing they were revolting against. Sounds a lot like how the Quakers in the middle colonies viewed education and schooling, parenting, and whatnot else. That it was to cultivate something that was already present. Um, Notably, that is not the Puritan idea of education, but it is still American, and it used to have a Christian framework that they, I suppose, had to rediscover. It was long gone by the 19th century. So I'm glad you brought that up because I think I made a note in the margin of my books that it sounded very much like the Quakers that were in the middle colonies. Um, do we have anything else on the transcendentalists before we sort of move on to the last to their decline and close out the book? Any last things? I will take that as a no. So now that we've sort of discussed the transcendentalists, this very American reaction, though if not slightly atheistic reaction to the foreign ideologies that started to become very popular. And just because we focus on the transcendentalists, just for historical accuracy, you should also know the other ideologies, the foreign ones, were still popular during this time. They were gaining popularity. They were being elaborated upon. So it's not like the transcendentalists just beat them out and won. It's just that we care about the transcendentalists particularly on this stream. Um, Now, unfortunately for us, I would say, given just looking at it in hindsight, what came next, the transcendentalists, you might say matured, others might say declined, died. It depends on how you view them as to what you describe them, but they definitely declined. So a lot of these transcendentalists, I think one of them died in particular. The One of the women, I can't remember her name. The other ones just sort of went back to normal society. Thoreau, for instance, was a pencil maker, and he just went back to pencil making, and he innovated pencil making. It was as I mentioned, sort of in the introduction of the Transcendentalists, his was a calculation. His trek into nature. He calculated the amount of money that his cabin cost at the pond, and he viewed doing that and spending the time at the pond in so much leisure and little work as worth it compared to the cost. He went back to pencil making though, and so his fundamental culture or outlook, this New England calculative culture, did not change, and he just sort of left. Um, and then a lot of these people just returned back to normal society, but their ideas didn't die. They transmutated. So this is where you start getting a lot of the sort of social crusades that characterize the reform movements in American society during this era. Abolitionism being one of the main ones. Then you get women's suffrage and feminism, temperance and prohibitionism. Uh, those sorts of social crusades. You can very easily read them as a very bastardized and base form of transcendentalism. Um, I don't exactly know if that was the direction that Brooks was going in this book. That was how I interpreted it, and I think I could defend that if pressed. I think I could defend it pretty well. Oh, and it's also worth noting Daniel Webster would have died at about this year, the 1850s, the decline of the Transcendentalists. So the group that we started with, the people at the optimistic point of the Young Republic, are dying off. The Transcendentalists are going home. The new ideologies from Europe have taken root and also, once again, influenced the sort of social crusades that characterize the country at this time. And this is where New England, and this is something that New England anti-abolitionists would point out. This is where New England takes on a very uh, non non theological tone. And the way that I mean that is that you see a lot less appeals to anything providential, higher, transcendental, and it's very much a crusade for the here and now society. There are appeals to the future, of course, but it's purely in social terms, how people live, the conditions of people, their experiences, their morality. There's no the appeals rather to providence die off at around this time. It becomes more
Yeah.
agnostic, if not atheistic.
It would be wrong to say any of this is Marxist, because obviously Marx is kind of a contemporary of this time, or maybe even a little bit after. But it certainly has
Right.
that flavor. It certainly has that flavor, and I think it's significant too. Someone like Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who's sort of a keystone in this particular era in the flowering of New England, explicitly opposed abolitionism and regarded it essentially as a British contagion that was sent to tear the United States apart.
Right, and it's something else that's worth mentioning is that a lot of these social crusaders viewed themselves in opposition to the academics and transcendentalists that we were just talking about, and perhaps very much, or I wouldn't say perhaps, the people we were critiquing for being too high up in the ivory tower. The social crusaders were the reaction, just to show you that for as much as we can complain, it can always get worse. They thought they were too much in the ivory tower, and they need to be on the ground fighting the evils of slavery, bigotry, and whatnot else. So, yeah, this is a and as you mentioned, Mr. Brooks, alluding to Holmes Senior, this would tear the country apart, and it caused the greatest amount of deaths and warfare, at least later on,
So it's not
of
just that,
Americans.
it's also, there's a really excellent book that goes through the entire history of New England that ends in 1865, and it's called The City State of Boston. I highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in the period. And the City State of Boston, the author Peterson essentially makes the case that winning the Civil War and achieving a lot of these social crusade ideas in the midst of the Civil War came at the price of New England as a uniquely as the unique heirs of the Puritans and as a sort of coherent form. Like obviously New England was still coherent after this, but the way that he brings it about is that the Puritan Republic was exchanged for victory in the Civil War, which is a sort of interesting idea. And I think when you look at it that way, there is some there in terms of the way that Boston looks, after after the 1850s and 60s.
Yeah, so this is I've heard people talk about this, and I unfortunately forget who now, because there's a lot of emphasis in our sphere, and I think rightly so, talking about the destruction of the South and Reconstruction. It's an old idea, but one that gets heavily suppressed by the state education system. Um, but as I forget who it was now, but this idea that New England also sort of got hollowed out, not by occupation, but just by getting subsumed into a more generic national identity that was separate from the Puritans, as you were talking about. This is something that's very important. And I will
I know
say, not
Christopher
to,
Sandbach has talked about it because he's the one who recommended that specific book to me.
okay. I was wondering if it was him because I remember a while ago he was talking about how old Southerners and honest to God Yankee New Englanders were both dying breeds caused by roughly the same events but for different reasons, and that struck me as a very
Yeah, the
prescient
alliance
insight.
between the Mugwump swamp Yankees and such.
Yeah, right. And so, yeah, this is a that was an insight that struck me, and you can really see that here, sort of the developments of that because the social historical American figures, but they sound and look nothing like the Puritans, and so this is probably like the final note that we'll have because I don't think we'll be focusing on New England as much from here on out. We'll be expanding our interest, but blaming the Puritans for this group that arose in contrast to the Transcendentalists, I think, is a very grave historical misstep. They look and sound and believe nothing similar. The Puritans and these social crusaders in the 1850s, and these social crusaders, I do believe bring about a much more generic, less rooted identity for this core part of the country that is New England. This place that has such a great heritage that we have been outlining for the last few weeks really does get supplanted by synthesis, if you will, not to use too loaded of a term, between these new ideologies and some of the American reactions.
I mean, I would say it's much worse than that. I would say 1848, which was defeated, arguably, depending on how you want to parse that in Europe. 1848 succeeded in America in many ways, with these social reformers essentially leveling the United States and extinguishing the control that these native traditions had from the very early days of the Puritan Republic. We lost an enormous amount, both north and south, in the alleged victory during the Civil War.
Right, and I don't think I have much else. That was like the main overarching narrative I wanted to present here, and I feel like a narrative for a book that was a narrative was fitting. Um, that's all I had. If you guys had any other overarching sweeping points, but otherwise I don't have anything else to belabor past this.
No, I think that about wraps it up. That was a really fascinating discussion that you just concluded with, though, in relation to sacrificing New England to win the Civil War, and also this concept of the victory of the 1848 Revolution in America. Obviously, that ties into the Civil War somewhat too. So perhaps those will leave the viewers with something to deliberate on. But let us quickly review the super chats and then wrap up the stream. So it looks like we have 3 today. We've got on Entropy, one from Skibum 220 for $5, 1 month subscriber streak. Well, thank you very much for tuning into the show and donating. Then we have one from Melon, our friend Melon, for $15, beating the $3 a stream allegations. Well, thank you very much, Melon. Yes, on Mr. D space last week, I was complaining a bit about how our last stream only brought in a $3 super chat. Well, the point of these streams isn't to make a ton of money, and obviously these have lower viewerships because these are the more elite intellectual streams, filling in a niche that has been long neglected. But it is nice to at least cover the cost of the book or something when we do these. But the more important thing is getting people to tune in. You've probably noticed by now we have specifically set out a path for these streams, and we've talked about the Puritans a lot. We will be moving on from that next week, but one definitely should be watching this American Spirits show as an ongoing series and watch all of the streams if you haven't, because they all tie into one another and are establishing and answering the question, of what is an American. And it would be great to get these out to a wider audience. I know this sort of material tends to pull less viewership than your sort of weekly news broadcast type things, but this is really important stuff for the people who are attuned to this sort of thing. So anyway, next super chat, one from Son of Haster, from the New Ivy League. Thank you. $10, New England. I love that place. Can't wait to catch the recording on this one. Yes, well, hopefully we did you well on this stream. I think we did a pretty good job of providing a fair representation on the thought patterns in New England at the time. And then finally, from Machiavelli Sucks to Go 7103 $4.99, he gives us a thumbs up in skin tone 1. Thank you very much. That is it for the supers. So thanks, guys, for tuning in and your donations. Anyone have anything final to add before we conclude? I will mention, of course, if not, the book we are going to read next week.
Oh, we got a latecomer super chat for $5. That would be I just saw Mr. Barney Boyle 6933 for $5 gives us a salute. So thank you very much. We very much appreciate it.
Yes, definitely. It takes a lot of work to do these streams. Let me tell you. So anyway, next week we will be moving away from New England and reading Frederick Jackson Turner's The Frontier in American History, first published in 1920. So this is another older one, examining something we haven't really looked into yet on American spirits. And then 2 weeks from now, we will be reading Common Sense, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, something that has also been neglected within our spheres. And 3 weeks from now, we have not come to a decision yet on what we're going to do. So we'll need to do that. And, that way anyone can pick up the book if they want. Who are we having on next week? Right. We're going to have on the Prudentialist next week, I think, for
you guys will
Frontier in
not
American
want to miss
History,
that.
right?
The Frontier in American History is a fantastic, seminal essay, and it's going to be directly building on some of the stuff that we're talking about here. Prudentialist is a subject matter expert. He and I did a paywalled stream of this for the Old Glory Club, and he will be bringing even more receipts for you all next week. So definitely tune into that.
Yes, this is going to be very exciting because this is a long-term project, as Charlie was underscoring, and it can't be taken out of just one stream on a one-stream basis. It has to be viewed in totality. So I'm excited to talk about the frontier after we've laid some groundwork in other regions of the country.
A very based endorsement of Mr. Prudentialist, and we actually have another super chat from Ms. Donnie Browning for $20, sending us a jiggling video game controller. It's a super sticker that's saying Woot, and it's an orange jiggling video game controller. Your donation is very much appreciated, Ms. Browning. And
thank you.
With that, I will drop my phone on the ground and sign off.